Now, we had many different guides when we went on our talking tour, and Mazen actually was towards the end, but he gave us such a good overview, I put him at the beginning. You can find him online. He's like prolific. He's an amazing man. He's Palestinian, but he spent 40 years in the States teaching mainly like medicine and genetics, but he's come back to Palestine to try and offer some foundation for his folks, and he set up this place with the University of Bethlehem called the Palestinian Museum of Natural History and History. And he's trying to uphold what's there, what's been part of there, and Mazen told us so much about the story and history of Palestine that I wanted to start this with him. But what I also wanted to start with was some of the teachings that people gave us before we went. And that's, so I'm United Church. United Church has made some decisions about what our particular stand in Israel and Palestine is. We've had people there for a long time, and we've talked to Christians there for a long time. And we know that there are many different ways to hear something around a circle. Each one of us brings our own perspective. The teaching that I got from the folks that I was with was a session they'd been to where somebody had talked to them about the bucket of facts that you carry with you. And we each carry our own bucket of facts. And it's not really our job to deny somebody else's bucket. It's their bucket. But it's also not our job to try and get somebody else to think our bucket is the only bucket. So I thought this is a pretty good image of, you know, what we do when we're trying to discern, right? Trying to figure out what's going on with the buckets, but also just what happens to us sometimes when we're dealing with other people's factor buckets and they really want us to be sure that it's theirs that we follow. So, facts and buckets. Facts on the ground. You heard that a lot there, particularly from folk with the Israeli government, that they want to put facts on the ground. They want settlements everywhere. They want archaeological findings. They're tunneling underneath the Dome of the Rock to try and find something that says there used to be a temple there, so they can use that fact on the ground to overthrow the Dome on the Rock. They want to be undeniable. They want it stitched up so well that there's no way to deny those facts, and then the world will have to accept that they're where they need to be, and the other people, well, they just aren't. So they have lots of ways to try and argue that those facts on the ground are accurate. And lots of tactics. Back at Akko, I was just struck by some of the similarities, not the bloodshed, but the imprisonments. And at Sepphoris, that Crusader fortress is up on the hill. And that's what the Crusaders did. I mean, that's what you did in those days, right? You got the high ground, and you put your forts on the high ground, and then you controlled everything, because you could see everything. And settlements are all on the high ground, which is good, because the low ground is arable, and you can plant on it. But it's also on the high ground so that by commanding the ground, you can command everything that goes in the Palestinian villages around that ground. So one of the things that Mazen told us about was this fellow, Lieutenant Colonel George Scholar, who's actually in Australia, an Australian governor, but was commissioned by the British government in the 1850s to take a look at the Middle East and see what they could do about it, because it was a pretty fractious area. They were already having trouble controlling it, it kept getting wiped out. And what would they do? So Scholar wrote a report called The Tranquilization of Syria and the East, Practical Observations and Suggestions in Furtherance of the Establishment of Jewish Colonies in Palestine. The most sober and sensible remedy for the miseries of Asiatic Turkey. 1857, I think. You can Google him though, it's early, it's before they had Palestine. But they knew they were going to get it. It was just a matter of time they got it. So Scholar writes the report and suggests that really encouraging more Jewish return to that area, European Jewish, would be good. It would be a European beacon, beachhead in that area. It's so much trouble for them in the empire. Theodor Herzl, around the same time, a little bit later in the late 1880s, is talking about a homeland, a place in the Middle East where Jewish people could feel somewhat safe, pass their own laws, not feel like they're going to get thrown out of homes because of pogroms or all the stuff that was going on at that time. He got together with a number of other Jewish and other intellectuals, became this Zionist movement, and started negotiations with whoever would listen to them, mainly Europeans, trying to say that if you get us the land, it'll be a good thing. And they had negotiations. Mazen told us, I haven't checked, you can check, that the Balfour Declaration, which I have checked, was encouraged in part because of an agreement. At the time it said that folk who were in the Zionist movement would really use as much influence as they could to try and keep America in the war, get them in and keep them in. Because it was 1917, and it was not good. Like, the Americans coming in turned the tide, we think, for the Allies. So there was an agreement there. Mazen says it's under the British Official Secrets Act. It's open now, you can go have a look at it. Whether it made a difference or not, it's interesting to know that even in those days, people had side deals and all kinds of different ways to get there. Arthur Balfour, also interestingly enough, I did do the research on this, was a noted anti-Semite. He really didn't like Jewish people, and he wanted them to leave England, and thought this would be the best way for it to happen. And that's often been, I mean, it's written in Zionist writings, this is actually okay for us. I mean, we can get those people who hate us to move us. Fine, whatever their motivation is. We can use them, that's good. And yeah. So that's, I just thought it was a familiar local name. Yeah. Allenby, everybody's been down Allenby. I had no idea who it was named after. He's a very famous British general who took Palestine away from the Turks in World War I. And, you know, where is Allenby Street? And it's in Tel Aviv, which is a Jewish city, and it's also, where is it here? Is it kind of like, isn't that First Nations land over there then? Anyway, I don't know if there's any subtext going on there, I have no idea. Okay, so in 1947, a lot of Jewish people have moved in and started to come back. But that's about the spread of it in 1947. In 1947, the UN says, okay, we agree. That World War II was the most horrific thing we've ever seen. Nothing like that can happen again. What do we have to do? And so they, without talking to Palestinians, decided to do this. And they did this. Now, if you hear, like, doing some reading from other folk, Jewish folk would say there were no Palestinians. Like, there was nobody there, and if there was anybody there, they didn't have a state. They were just a people. They were a stateless people. So there's nobody to talk to. Who would you talk to? They had no spokespersons, they had no government, they weren't bona fide. Whatever happened to them, the world could do whatever it wanted to because they didn't really exist as a state. Or even so much as a people. If you talk to some folk, they'll say there weren't many people there either. Mazen begs to differ. He says there's been people there for 12,000 years. If you read history, you can always find somebody referring to some Palestinian Phoenician identity in that area. He says the people have always been on the land, that you can do the DNA studies and you'll see they look the same then as they do now. It's always been the people that have stayed, the leaders have changed. And he said the people have been whoever they needed to be. If they needed to be followers of Baal, okay, well, if that's who I need to be today, then I'll be that. If I need to be Yahweh this week and I need to be Muslim next week, okay. I need to be on my land and I need to be looking after my family. The rest of it was hard, but they could get through it. He says they've always been there. This is what happened. It's an image from the Yasser Arafat Museum where we went. And it just shows where people left. Like, they call this the Nakba, where people in Israel would call this the War of Liberation and how they beat the 5 armies from Arab countries. Palestinian people who are living in their villages one day and then getting bombed and driven out by soldiers the next day just see this as the Nakba, the Great Terror, the day of wrath and destruction, the day we had to leave our homes. And they fled. They went all over the place. In the Arafat Museum is an image of just shoes in the desert, just to try and give us a sense of all those people, what was going on for them. So from 49 to 67, this is what happened. So you saw the partition map, the proposed partition, this is what happened. Israel took a lot more than was suggested in the partition and said they needed to have that to feel safe. If you read writings, I mean, it's always been the intent to have the whole thing. Nobody's unclear about that in the Israeli government or in the writings of the folk who were in the Zionist movement. They clearly need to have the whole, and that's what they're going for. So that's what it looks like now. And a lot of that green is actually, like 60% of that green area is directly controlled by the Israeli military. It's called Area C. There was an agreement called the Oslo Accords that split Palestine up into 3 areas, Area A, B, and C. A is about 17%, that's the densely populated cities like Ramallah, Bethlehem. B is kind of the villages around those cities, the feeder villages, about 20%, maybe 21%, and the rest, the other 60%, is less populated by Palestinians, much more populated by settlers these days, and has the natural resources in the water, and that's totally under the control of the Israeli military. We went to Canada Park. I've got some olives over there from Canada Park because the sign outside of Canada Park said it was the site of 3 villages. One of them they said was Emmaus, but then there's 2 other villages that say they're Emmaus, so who knows for sure. But Emmaus is important in our stories about where people met Jesus on his resurrection. They met him at Emmaus and they had food with him, and when they broke bread together, they realized here he was in this person they were having bread with. And so it's this story of incarnation in the stranger that exists for us. And Emmaus is an important story, I think. But Emmaus as a village was destroyed in 1949. It was bulldozed. And the Canadians contributed heavily to the fund to plant trees in Emmaus and the other 2 villages, because we thought we were greening Israel. That's what we thought we were doing. But what we were doing was making sure that fir trees grew heavily and thickly in an area where a village used to be, and the villages are very hard to rebuild around fir trees. And that's maybe Emmaus. I brought some olives. A poem from the Arafat Museum. Tell the world, tell it about a house with a lantern they shattered, about an axe that killed a tulip and a fire that incinerated a braid. Tell about a ewe that was never milked, about dough prepared by a mother yet never baked, about a thatched mud roof. Tell the world, tell it. Everybody asked us to tell the world. Prickly pear cactus. So those are the areas I talked about. Yeah, I can hardly tell what's pinkish and what isn't, but C is the tan area. And you can see where that little bulge is in the belly? That's going to be important later. Oh, in the green line, the UN said that to Israel after the second Intifada, when people were blowing up buses and there was a lot of violence and pushback from Palestinians, if you need to build a wall, you can. You can build it along these borders. And so they built the wall, and I mean, it's pretty close to those borders. It takes in a lot more territory than it was supposed to, but so it's not right on the borders, it's just built. That's Israeli checkpoints. If you're a Palestinian, you've got to go through Israeli checkpoints. If you're me, you don't. We were on a bus, and we were never stopped. We had a Palestinian guide and a Palestinian driver, and they just waved us through everything. So our Palestinian guide said, this isn't about security. This is about humility. It's about keeping you in your place. Because if you're a Palestinian, you go through those checkpoints. There were flying checkpoints that were set up as roadblocks that we had to wait for, like an hour or 2 to get through. But if you're Palestinian, you go through them all the time. If you're a Palestinian farmer, and your farm is on the other side of the wall, you might have to go 10 miles down the wall, go through a checkpoint, come back to farm your land. And there's an Israeli law that says if you don't work your land steadily, I think it's 2 years, it's gone. You lose that land. And so if you get turned away at the checkpoint often enough, then it's difficult for you. You have to have permission to go through a checkpoint. Into Jerusalem, you have to have a good reason for wanting to travel, for being there. It has to be signed off by the military governor. It's not easy to get. If you have a job in there, it's even harder to get permission to work in there. So it's Palestinians would say this is just a method of control, and it's deliberate humiliation of people. That's certainly how they see it. Israelis would tell you something else. I'm sure they would. But Mazen said, the man at the beginning, he said he has friends who get really upset because he said they call it the Israeli Defense Force. And from our perspective, there's nothing defensive about those people. They're coming after us all the time. Why don't they just call it the Israeli Aggressive Force? And Mazen said, well, you're wrong. He said, he didn't say this exactly, but what he was saying was that they're a fact bucket. He said, they're the pioneers in the Conestoga wagons crossing the plains, and the Indians are attacking them. Of course they're defending themselves. He said, that's how they see the world. It's not really the way Mazen would like them to see the world, but it is how it is seen. So they're defending themselves with all these forts. And those are just the checkpoints, not the settlements. The settlements are equally as prolific. And here, we went to the Holocaust Museum. I think we needed to go there. I don't want to forget that. And I don't want to forget that there's a need for people to feel safe and to not feel like they're under attack all the time. I also want to put it in context, because every time I talk about this lately on social media, there's somebody willing to tell me I'm anti-Semitic. I must be, because I'm not in favor of what they're doing to protect themselves. And therefore, I must be anti-Israeli, and I'm not. Some of the stuff in the museum was horrific. Some of the beginning edges of it, where they decided who was Jewish and who wasn't Jewish, it's happening there now. If you're Jewish, you have full citizenship. If you're not, you're of Arab descent, you don't have the same citizenship. You don't have the same rights to own land. All land is owned by the government of Israel, and is, well, 95%. The other 5% is institutions, some churches, and is leased to people who want to build on it. All the land, even the land in the occupied territories, you have to get government permission to build on. Once you have it, you're good. But I didn't want us to ever forget that this happened. And I also came to think that perhaps what we had done as a world is that we had solved a world problem, anti-Semitism, with a Palestinian solution. This is one of our guides, Angela Godfrey Epstein. She's Jewish Israeli. She was our guide and companion. She told us that one of their prime ministers, Yitzhak Rabin, who had negotiated peace treaties and was assassinated, she said, Yitzhak thought we were ready to do this. She said, her words were, we were ready to come out of the ghetto. And she said, we're not. We're still so wounded. We're still so suffering from the abuse that we've been undergone for at the ages that we have, that we can only be takers. We can never be givers. We just don't have it in us. And she's a woman who's done a lot of her own personal work. She's a Kabbalah practitioner. She tries to see light everywhere. She was also married to a Bedouin for 20 years. It probably helped shape her image of the world. Wonderful things to say about Bedouins. Jonathan Cook is a British journalist. He met us at Sephora's. He's married to a Palestinian woman, has 2 Palestinian children, lives in Nazareth, is really worried about his kids. It's starting to get harder and harder to live there as a Palestinian. So he told us the story of Sephora's, about what happened there, that in 1949 it was identified as it was a village that was in high revolt against the British, but they actually lost most of their leaders in 1936. But it was identified as a village you wanted to pay attention to. So they bombed it first, then they sent the army in to drive people out, and then they bulldozed it. And what you see behind Jonathan is kind of the fence around it. It's right across from the church we looked at earlier, and there's just rubble there. But Jonathan talked about the story of that village. What it used to look like is on top. That's what it looks like now. Zipporah is the Jewish settlement that's there now. And this is the well. It's kind of at the base of the hill. People used to come and get their water there. A lot of them ended up in Nazareth. They're still called internally displaced refugees. They live in Nazareth. They don't have a right to return to Zipporah. And they're refugees in Nazareth. But they come back to this field all the time. They have family picnics, car washes, ball games, whatever they can to assert that they're still there and they're still in that field. This is, he's just, Abu Arab, he's known. He's just a poet, a wonderful poet who grew up in that village. This is a settlement house on his dad's land, and this is one of his poems that Jonathan read to us on the site. We did not weep when we were leaving, for we had neither time nor tears, and there was no farewell. We did not know at the moment of parting that it was a parting, so where would our weeping have come from? We did not stay awake all night, and did not doze the night of our leaving. That night we had neither night nor light, no moon rose. That night we lost our star, our lamp misled us. We didn't receive our share of sleeplessness, so where would the wakefulness have come from? It's stories that they didn't know, seriously, they thought they were going to come back. There's always been this thought of return, and so when you think about a refugee camp that's been there for 70 years, and you wonder why, it's because there's always been a thought of return, that they were pushed out. That's happened before in war, it's happened in Syria. People get pushed out, but they come back to their homes after the war. This is another just shot of the remains of Sephoria. This is a cactus fence. Apparently about 300 years ago, some wise person brought cactus over to Palestine. They used it as fence. They used it everywhere because it was this wonderful living hedge that no animal in its right mind would go through. And so when the Israelis destroyed the villages, They clearly wanted to destroy the cactus too, but there isn't a thing you can do to destroy cactus apparently. If you can throw it in the ditch, it doesn't matter, it'll come back. So it keeps coming back. This is at the cemetery in Seferia. And everywhere we went, we saw cactus. The Palestinians see it as resistance, a sign of resistance from the Museum of Natural History. In Lydda, in Ramleh, in the Galilee, we shall remain. Like a wall on your chest, and in your throat, like a shard of glass, a cactus thorn, and in your eyes, a sandstorm. There's Nazareth, and that's just one. Nazareth is huge, but it's artificially constrained. It's in Israel, but it has its own set of building requirements. There's a border around it that it cannot spread beyond, and there's height requirements on most of the family residential buildings. It can only be 4 stories. And so if you saw a Jewish settlement with the same population, or burgeoning, because Nazareth is burgeoning, they've got a huge growing population, there'd be lots of tall buildings, but not here. They're not allowed to. And so there's this big pressure on people trying to move. They're citizens of Israel, but they're not allowed to live in other parts of Israel. And if you tick off the Israeli government, they can move you. So you have to be careful. Also notice that on all the roofs, like that's a hot water tank with solar, but on all the roofs in the occupied territory, everybody has huge water tanks. That's in part because water is scarce, but also in part because Israel decides when to send water and when not to, and sometimes you'll be without water for a week. So you have to have a big enough water tank. He's a farmer. He's been a farmer for a long time. He didn't want to be a farmer. He wanted to go to school and get his doctorate in something, but he wasn't allowed to go to school. He was locked up. In fact, on administrative warrants, they could lock you up for 6 months, review it, lock you up for another. They could lock you up indefinitely on an administrative warrant without trial. He was locked up for 2 years. And I don't know what he did to take them off, but he's a very persistent guy. I could see where you might actually, the sand in your eye thing would probably get to you after a while with Fayez. He had a farm, his dad had a farm. They grew all kinds of crops, they sold, that's how they made their living. The government of Israel decided that it would be okay for chemical plants to set up right outside of his farm and all the other farmers in that little fertile area where they are. Keter Plastics is one of the organizations that we're boycotting from the occupied territories. I don't know if that's one of theirs. Could be. I have no idea. But that chemical plant started to dust his crops. And his crops weren't doing well. And neither were his Jewish neighbors' crops. They weren't doing very well either. So he took the chemical plant to court. And they said, well, you can't prove we're doing anything. So he took the dust, took it to an Israeli lab, and they said it's an official secret. We can't tell you what's in it. So then his neighbor, his Jewish neighbor, she took them to court, and then all the Jewish farmers settled out of court with the chemical plant that on the 40 days of the year when the wind blows towards their farms, the plant will shut down. The other 320, it doesn't. It just, the prevailing wind is the other direction. Faiz's place. So that's the chemical plant. It's a way of oppressing without oppressing. It was almost like Kafkaesque in that country. It was like there were just rules and regulations, and there was nothing you could do to the system. The system was always there. And that's the other side. So he got together with that Jewish farmer. They knew each other fairly well. He said she was just as feisty about that chemical plant as I was. And so, well, what do you do when neighbors talk to each other? You build a fence. That's what they call the fence. That's like 30 feet high. That's the wall. It also cut off a chunk of his farm. Oh, and this is what you read outside of anything in Area A. There's a big red sign. This road leads to Area A under the Palestinian Authority. The entrance for Israeli citizens is forbidden, dangerous to your lives, against the law. So if you're Israeli and you see that, it's like, holy cow, those people really want to hurt me. I better not go there. And you know, there's a history with the Intifada. There's been lots of time when it's been dangerous, but there's also been times of peace building, bridge building. Before the wall, I'm told, where people kind of flowed back and forth. Palestinians went and picked olives. I mean, the ordinary people live their ordinary lives. This is a sign inside the farm. It says, water, energy, and food are freely available for all humankind when we no longer follow the laws of capital, but rather the logic of nature. Fayez was all about getting out of capital control. I mean, if he recognizes the root of his oppression, it's not the government of Israel. He thinks there's somebody above that that Israel works on behalf of. It's not the British Empire anymore, but there's still an empire out there that needs control and needs a bridgehead in that region. And maybe not even the American Empire. So Faiz has done all kinds of really creative things. This is a manure tea methane composter, so he just lit off the methane to show us that it works as a fuel. And the manure tea he mixes with his water so he can irrigate his crops, which are mostly in greenhouses. Oh, purchasing power, also a sign in the farm. The farm is both an act of resistance and a source of income for the Tanib family. We invite you to support this resistance by buying our products. And it is a resistance, but it's not the resistance you think of. What I've learned from Israeli Palestinians when I was there is that they've had to really change their resistance. There's still some kids throwing rocks, for sure. But the resistance is much different now. It's much more, I don't know, much more rooted in the land and in the people. It's different. And this, purchasing and supporting this farm is an act of resistance. And he's doing this little experimental room that he learned about from somebody. He's connected with many different people in the world doing like low water, low fertilizer gardening or crop raising. And one, he's got a pond with koi fish in it, and then he circulates that water through the tomato plants, so the tomato plants get fed by the fish fertilizer that comes out of the fish, and they keep circulating the water. It's like a hydroponics operation. It's amazing. And he's doing that kind of work to try and get himself off of the system. He has solar power that runs little computer fans that keep the seedlings aerated. He's doing everything he can to be off-grid. I thought he should come here. There's a lot of people who are off-grid here. And so he would say that the real enemy is the system we're all caught by. And we're all caught by this system. We're all oppressed by the same system. Some of us are just oppressed more overtly and in ways that we can recognize quite quickly because they don't let us go anywhere. But there are others who, never knew that there was a place that we couldn't go. Israel routinely, the military authorities in Israel routinely order the demolition of trees and villages. And this woman's father had planted one tree for each child. And when they came to take her tree, well, that's where she was. You can see the soldiers up in the back in the Jeep. And the soldiers aren't bad people. They're really, they're like 19-year-olds. They don't actually know, I don't think. So then we went to Adamira, we're in Ramallah, which is the de facto capital of Palestine. Palestinians will still say East Jerusalem is their capital. It's an important city to them. You saw the Dome of the Rock and the mosques there. They really want to be there, but they're not allowed to be there. The centers of government in East Jerusalem are all Israeli, and they're all authority, police, prisons. So in Ramallah, where the Palestinian Authority is, we met with Sahara and Lana, and they just talked about accompanying people in prison. There are 7,000 people imprisoned in Israeli prisons from the Palestinian population. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them it's political. So Lana told us about her interactions, just following people, trying to help them. They talked a lot about people being taken, imprisoned, and tortured, that it was routine, and that's what happened. That Israeli authorities wanted, maybe they wanted information, but really it was to try and turn people, to disrupt the community, to express that they can do this and they do this, to exert their will so that people will no longer revolt. They will no longer push back. There will be no more intifadas. If you suppress people hard enough and long enough, they give up. So they torture them. And that's a time-honored tactic. It's been practiced by many governments in many places. So when we asked them at the end of, we were there for 2 hours, and I've got books that they produced, they're on their website, of just incidents of interviewing prisoners, talking to them about what happened to them, what they were arrested for, what was going on. And that they're all in military courts, there's not much you can do. In fact, there's very little you can do. So we asked them, what is it that keeps you in this? We asked everybody what gives you hope. We asked them, what keeps you in this? The folk with Adamir. And I think it was Salah that said, we can't do anything else. We don't have the luxury of despair, she said. We just don't have that. We can't lay down. We can't give up. Every contact we make, even if we are only able to maybe help somebody's sentence get shorter by a day, makes such a huge difference in their lives and their families' lives that we can't stop. We just have to keep doing this. And what gives us hope is you. You go home and tell people what's going on here and maybe it'll change. It's your government that can make this change. It's people living outside of Israel, because we're caught in it, all of us. They're all caught in it. It's how do we make change.